Thank you, and good afternoon, comrades, and welcome to this 66th anniversary of the Freedom Charter. I will be your program director. My name is Nomantu Nkomorali Huku, and I will be doing that with Comrade Ronald Lamula. A warm welcome again to all our esteemed panelists and speakers, Deputy Secretary Mama Jessie Duarte, NEC members, participants, and comrades. As I've indicated, my name and the province where I come from, it's Gauteng. I will be doing this job of directing this program on this webinar on the 66 years of Freedom Charter with our NEC member, Comrade Ronald Lamula. Since the adoption of the Freedom Charter on the 26th of June, 1955, various clauses inspired our struggle. Students mobilized behind the banner that the doors of learning and culture shall be opened. All democratic and freedom-loving citizens worked so that the people shall govern for houses, security, and comfort for the people to share the country's wealth. The enduring aspirations of the Freedom Charter continue to inspire us, and we are codified in the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. As delegates gathered in Kliptown on that cold winter in June 1955, one of the resounding slogans was Maibuye Africa, and for today's 60th anniversary, we focus on that clause, which I will open quote, the land shall be shared amongst those who work in it, close quote. We have a great lineup of speakers. Without any further ado, we start with our panel who will set the scene. How this clause developed 66 years ago still remained relevant today to us. Our panelists are Dr. Matthew Phosa, our former ANC Treasurer General and the Premier of Mpumalanga, former Premier of Mpumalanga Province, and leading the ANC engagement on the amendments to the Section 25 of the Constitution. The other speaker will be Comrade Fasia Hassan, representing the ANC Youth League, a former Fees Must Fall activist, a feminist, and one of the youngest members of the Gauteng Provincial Legislature. We always call her our last born, and she's very efficient and eloquent in dealing with the opposition in that parliament. The third one will be Baba Jeremy Koronin, representing the South African Communist Party, having served as its Deputy General Secretary and as ANC MP and Deputy Minister of Transport, and he also co-authored the book 30 Years of Freedom Charter with Comrade Raymond Satner. The next one will be Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, whose name has become synonymous with the national discourse about the land question, and authors of books. The one of those is This Land is Ours and Land Matters. Last but not least, our dear sister, and some of us a friend, Comrade Togo Didiza, NEC member, a current Minister of Agriculture and Land Reform and Rural Development, who has been part of the architect of land issues in South Africa for the last 27 years. Each speaker will have 10 minutes for their intervention, and I will start with, unfortunately, I have to switch a little bit because Fasia is having an engagement that he must attend to. Although he will still be with us connecting on another gadget. We will start with the last born of the country and of the province, and especially in the legislature, Fasia, and then we will come to Dr. Matthew Phosa immediately after that. And you have the floor, Fasia. Will you please just try and unmute yourself and take up the floor for us? Thank you. And thank you so much to everyone, to the listeners out there.
Thank you very much. Revolutionary greetings to everybody. I apologize. Being a youth leader, you're always on the ground and you're always very much involved with what's going on. Can I just check that I am audible enough?
You are absolutely audible, but there's a little bit of noise in your background. If they can close the door wherever you are, will be highly appreciated. Thank you. But can go ahead, yeah. Notify them to keep quiet a bit.
No, thank you to the leadership. I'll try and sensitize them to the sound. Thank you very much. Tonight I'm here representing not just the Youth League, but young people in terms of the Freedom Charter. In today's preparation for the topic, as we know, land is one that's not just emotive and it's not just sensitive to the people, but it's also one in which it was inherently linked to our dignity. And it's also something in which, sorry, Chairperson, I'm just trying to manage the sound levels here. Okay, right. Thank you. I was trying to unmute a better sound level now. Okay, all right. I can't hear you guys very well, but that's not a problem. Right. So in preparation for today's topic, in terms of land and the accessibility of land, it was a very interesting thing for me to do some research around and really find and understand, sort of from a youth perspective, setting the scene around access to land. We know that there's a number of different resolutions that the Youth League over the years have talked about and have spoken about. But up to now, it's been quite an academic discussion in many ways. It hasn't been one that I think we've realized well enough. And I also believe it's something that has required quite a deeper understanding and provocation. And I think it's also important to understand the discussion around land from its genesis, right? Before the arrival of colonial powers or imperial powers, there was a much greater understanding of communal land and about how we actually interacted with each other. African communities were very, very sophisticated in their social constructs, in their political constructs, until, of course, and also there was a lot of, there were different areas of land that were governed by different groups of people. But there was by and large some ability to interact with each other on a positive basis. Yes, for economic opportunity. Yes, of course, there was also violent interaction at some points around conquering, etc. But there was definitely a very sophisticated land system that was in place. And then, of course, you fast forward to the arrival of colonial powers and what that does, and that really being the genesis of, we know colonialism, imperialism, yes, but also around capitalism and about the ripping of land away from our people and what that did to the dignity of society and the dignity of Black African communities in particular, but not only them. And in order to have this discussion, we really do need to put it in the right context. And I think some of the other panelists will go into more detail around this, I think, particularly Advocate Thembeka Ngaqube, because that's actually what his book is about. But I do think it's necessary for us to get into it. But I also think, in addition to all of those things, right, we can unpack the history of it. We can look at different points in history in which young people were at the forefront of the fight for land. Young people were at the forefront of agitating for that change, not just on a policy level, but on a very, very practical level. But I want to talk about what it means for young people, right? Because a lot of people, we can talk rhetoric, we can talk about it on an academic level, but what does it actually mean for a young person on the ground? And I think that's the most important part about placing it, or the land question and the land discussion, especially the amendment to Section 25, placing it in a space in which it actually does affect young people. So yes, there's been this big push, and we're expecting some sort of change to Section 25 of the Constitution, but we really need to discuss whether it's still accessible and whether young people in particular are going to be benefiting from this. Because it's always been the view of the Youth League that young people do need to be at the forefront, and young people do need a deliberate, specific intervention. So there's some discussions I think that we need to be having around a youth fund when we're looking at land expropriation. We need to look at support for young farmers. We need to support young youth-owned SMMEs. We also need to have a discussion around urban versus rural land, because when we talk about land expropriation, a lot of people look at it through a very agricultural lens, but we also look at it through a very rural sort of lens. I'm right now in Venda or in Thohoyandou rather, and there's quite a lot of land. And a lot of people think that this is what we are talking about exclusively when we talk about land expropriation. But what is the discussion about urban land? What are we doing to support youth-owned businesses in cities? What are we doing to support young people also in the rural spaces to ensure that they actually do have that kind of access?
And that goes beyond changing Section 25, because even if we change Section 25 in terms of the land clause, does that mean that young people in particular have access to that space? Does it mean that those barriers to entry are still in existence, or have they been taken down? And the unfortunate truth is that they probably will still be in existence. So we need to talk some practical measures, and that's why earlier I mentioned something around a youth fund around land expropriation, so that young people can identify those pieces of land. They can put forward different types of economic specialization, or whatever it is the intention is for that land, and find a way in which we can actually give them the necessary financial support, yes, but also the necessary non-financial support. So we always think about this question only in terms of the numbers, right? In terms of actual amounts physically, or rather financially, and it goes beyond that as well. It's about how do we give young people access to the right kinds of technology and innovation, so that we can take when we take back land and when we expropriate it and redistribute it fairly, what does that then do for young people? And one of the big pushes that's coming around in this discussion does tie into the fact that we have extremely high youth unemployment rates. We know that the numbers have just come out from Stats SA, and I think according to the narrow definition, for under the age of 35, it's 46.3% of young people who are unemployed. But the reality of the matter is that those numbers are much, much higher. Because when you look at the narrow definition, you're only looking at people who are currently looking for work. How many young people do we know in our own personal lives who have given up the search for work because they're just so disillusioned? So I'm tying this in because it's very important. When we talk about innovation, when we talk about land expropriation, all of those things need to link to youth empowerment and youth development in particular. So let me give you some specifics around some of the thinking that I think would be useful for young people, or that we think as the Youth League would rather be useful. And that's particularly around agri-tech. So that's technology that's around agriculture that we can use to take a small or a young farmer who owns a small piece of land to the next level. There's a big focus on agro-processing as well. And that basically is around understanding that we can, of course, plant crops and utilize different raw materials. But the moment we do something to those raw materials, not only can we sell them at a higher price, so that means there's more economic opportunity, but there's also more opportunity for innovation and specialization. So perhaps one of the things we need to think about in terms of practicalities when we talk about the land question is about how we assist community co-ops, community cooperations that are youth-led, where government, for example, can take the security levels and say that we're going to purchase the agri-tech. Those are the different types of innovative technologies and machinery, put it in a particular area, and then on a rotational basis, youth-owned SMMEs and youth-owned community co-ops can then utilize that technology and utilize those different elements to take those businesses to the next level. Therein also creating a value chain and a supply chain that can assist. My sincerest apologies. Yeah, we're all in a venue. Hopefully that won't interrupt again. So basically around the supply chain, the value chain that can be used to implement youth development on different levels. And that's why I sort of started this discussion by saying, well, it's not just around rural land. Yes, it is about agriculture. I've given you an example, but it's about a lot more than that. And I think that's really the kinds of ideas that we want to get about. And most importantly, to understand that young people are not looking for rhetoric. They're not looking for academic discussions. They're not looking necessarily for the right kind of language necessarily. They're looking for practicalities, and they're looking for things that are going to assist them. Last week, I was in the city of Tshwane interacting with young people, and there was a young person from Mamelodi who came forward, and he's part of a backyard farmers initiative. And what he was saying was very profound. He said, no matter what the department says, no matter what Section 25 says, no matter what the policy says, if it doesn't trickle down or get implemented on the ground for young people, people like himself are not going to be able to survive. And they have a communal farming project where they use areas that are basically areas you would consider dumping sites in township areas, and they turn those into community food gardens, but they also use that as an opportunity to implement skills development in their communities, opportunity for employment, but they also try and partner with different schools, with I think it's community faith-based organizations, and they're really trying to grow this project. But the reason why I'm citing this particular example is, for me, it drove home the fact that discussions on these sorts of levels are fundamentally important. But if they don't come down to the ground and they don't actually affect positively the lives of young people and the lives of people who actually need this, then unfortunately we're going to have missed the point. And one thing in closing that I just want to also add in is one of the policy changes that we've been looking at, and it's a recent policy change. And it's come through from the National Council of Provinces. It's called the Upgrading of Land Tenure Rights Bill. And I know Minister will be very familiar with it. But the reason why I cite it is because it's a very important piece of legislation that doesn't necessarily change Section 25, but rather gives effect to Section 25 around the question of redress.
In conclusion,
thank you. In conclusion, this is important particularly because there are lots of other methods in which we can actually implement Section 25 and meaningful redress, especially to young people, especially to young women who are constantly dispossessed of land. And let me also apologize for all of the different problems and sound difficulties, which always, I think, tend to happen when you're in a hybrid event. But other than that, young people don't want rhetoric, they really want practical measures, and we really need to move from academic discussions to people on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Fasia. Then let's move to Dr. Matthew Phosa, our former Treasurer General and the Premier of Mpumalanga, former Premier of Mpumalanga Province. Now he is the one that is leading our engagement on the amendments to Section 25 of our Constitution. I'm handing over to you, Dr. Phosa, to lead us in the process, in the discussion.
Thank you, Chairperson, and thank you all the leaders of the NEC who are in this on the screen, and all members of the NEC led by the DSG. Thank you for the opportunity and the honor to allow us to make a small input on this matter. I am a member of the legal team made up of Comrade Bulelani Ngoka, Vusi Pikoli, Sandy Lutlina, and others. We requested to try and research, do a lot of research, and make input into the discussions in the ad hoc committee of Parliament. And we're joined by other comrades, Comrade Minor, Comrade Mahlatsi, and others, very active comrades, parliamentarians, and the chief whip is part of the whole team. Now, if you gave context to the discussion we're having, I have difficulties in knowing exactly what is the beginning. Maybe it's because I represent some of the Khoi and the Sans in matters of recognition. They say, and I'm going to keep this to raw as it is, that in 1488, they came from the western part of Southern Africa. They were the first ones here. And fast forward, they say the Zulus arrived here 1709. And the Xhosa, Tsonga, Siswati, and Tswana arrived 1800. And fast forward, they recognize when the ANC was formed. And then they look at 1961, they say, sold out. And they look at 1994, they say, destruction of the power of Africa. And the heading of this thing is the true factual history of South Africa. I've shared this before with the DST, but they keep throwing this into my face. And they say we're negotiating as if they don't exist. Now, fast forward again, I'd like to read a statement by one of our former presidents who said, it will seem to stand to reason that before the ANC and the broad democratic movement amend or otherwise alter the national constitution and the strategic posture on the land question, as stated in the Freedom Charter, they would have to ensure the most thoroughgoing discussion within the ANC and the rest of the broad democratic movement. In the light of this requirement, fundamental to the functioning of the democratic movement for many decades, it is vitally important that as the ANC works to help amend Section 25 of the National Constitution, it must respect the perspective on land redistribution stated in the Freedom Charter, and thus the task to address simultaneously the land and national questions. Honor the decisions of the July 2018 ANC NEC Lekgotla that, and I quote, the ANC will, through the parliamentary process, finalize a proposed amendment to the Constitution that outlines more clearly the conditions under which expropriation of land without compensation can be effected. This is an opening remark by Comrade Thabo Mbeki, our former president, and it's also his closing remark in the article he recently wrote. Now, we were thrown into the deep end and asked to research. And we went all over and consulted extensively as a team. We looked at a report by the late Comrade Buyo Mahlati, may so rest in peace, the report by Comrade Khalema, the panel report, the Legal Resource Center, the 200,000 submissions to Parliament. We looked at all those and tried to draw a generalization about them. We looked at all existing case law on this matter. And of course, then we also looked at the need to consult different political parties. We met the Al Jamaat, ATM, which is basically the baby of EFF. The PAC didn't have a leader, so they withdrew. The NFP had one member who attended. He's a sheikh. I can't remember his name. Very kind sheikh. At the end of the discussion, I asked him when is he joining the ANC. He said when we are ready to invite him. He was very much aligned with our position. Then we met with Inkatha Freedom Party. Then they was really basically asking questions. What does the concept of custodianship mean? Land reform. What was interesting that they never raised the issue of Buthelezi of the Ngoyama Trust. Nothing. They didn't even refer to it. And then we met with the Freedom Front. Basically, at the end of the day, we were told that they're looking for a communal land for themselves. When I asked Mr. Melder, do you mean the Buddha Start? He said yes. So they haven't moved at all from where they were in 1994. Then we met the Democratic Party. Well, they're basically swearing at us that there's no need for amendment and going all right-wing and right-wing and right-wing. No interest of the majority of the people, but they are only their constituency. We met the African Christian Democratic Party. Very nice sounding, but at the end of the day, they just sounded like the DA. Then we met the EFF, and I want to make a few points here, because they're the biggest noise maker at the moment. So we put matters in context. The EFF, we met them 3 times. And then the 3rd time, of course, they didn't turn up, whereas all of us were there. So we marked them absent. They don't even mention this in the noise they're making, that they failed to turn up at the meeting. They have not given us any good reason why they're not turning up. The issues, because I don't have enough time, which they're raising is the issue around expropriation and without compensation. The issue around what is compensation? Can it be nil or not? Now, their view is basically saying it's nationalization, full stop. There must be no compensation. But if you look at Comrade Tabo's document going forward, and we agree with him, is that whatever you do, you should respect the economic space. You should not destroy the economy. You should not discourage investment. You should not destroy the agricultural land. You should not create food insecurity. All those precautions. They don't care about any of those things. They say all land must be in the custodianship of the state. Now, we don't differ about custodianship. We're saying right now, a lot of land is already in custodianship of the state. You have about 5 million hectares of land which can already be distributed, dished out. I think Comrade Togol will speak more eloquently on these things. So the noise around this is whether or not there should be compensation, expropriation with compensation or without compensation. They say no compensation. If you take a mall somewhere in Durban, would belong to someone who has a title deed, how do we deal with that type of thing? Once there's improvement on the land and you don't pay compensation, you are going to court. And the ANC will be locked into 5,000, 10,000 court cases. And that's not what the ANC wants to find itself in. If you argue about the custodianship, the state already has custodianship of a lot of land, and it's likely to buy more and put it in custodianship and issue it as it and when the need arises. And answer even the Youth League's question about where will we have a space to have more land? And I think the answer is yes, the more people will have more land. So where we're sitting, we are comfortable that we have consulted extensively, internally and externally. Who did we consult internally? We consulted the NEC itself. I mean, we had a 6-hour meeting after a long presentation and NEC members responding to us. That was very effective consultation as far as I'm concerned. The NWC, we met them and we're still going to meet them again on Monday. The NEC subcommittee on legal matters, we met them under Comrade Mutiz and we all agreed. We met with ad hoc committee of parliament several times and we have become then an appendage of them. We consult one another every day and every week, and then we talk together, we agree. When we go to meet with NEC, all the officials or NWC, we go together as a team of the ANC. We met with the political committee of the ANC in Parliament, led by the Deputy President. There's no one we haven't met. We met officials repeatedly so they can guide the discussions as unfold. An issue came up, which is part of this infantile disorder noise, which is in the media, whether or not the EFF should meet with officials of the ANC. Our advice, and I think we all agreed with the president and the official, that it's all the battle of high moral high ground, looking at the upcoming elections. We didn't think it was necessary because there is a platform in Parliament where the EFF and other political parties could meet and still host trade. And we think they should go there and host trade. If they still want to host trade with the ANC, the door is not shut in their faces, as the media needs to want us to understand. But the fact of the matter is, the officials have agreed that they will not meet the EFF because it's not worth it. You know, they must meet with our parliamentary people and respect them. So that's the framework where we are at the moment. I want to leave it there.
Thank you, Dr. Matthew Phosa. Then now we will move and go to Comrade Jeremy Cronin, representing the South African Communist Party. Over to you, Babu Cronin.
Thank you, Comrade Chair, and greetings to all the comrades who are participating, including the panelists. Comrade Chair, I've got a PowerPoint which I have forwarded to Comrade Phoebe. So if we could bring it up, it would make speaking to the topic a little easier.
Thank you. Shanaz, can you help us to upload the presentation? While Shanaz is uploading the presentation, let me indicate that once Lamula joins us, he will definitely acknowledge some of the speakers that I have not acknowledged, especially the provincial leadership. Thank you.
Okay, well, while we're waiting for the upload to happen, let me begin where I was going to begin. So I was going to begin from a slightly different perspective, which has already been touched on a little bit by Comrade Vasia. You know, I was struck by the fact that our COVID-19 curfew gets lifted at 4 a.m. in the morning. And I wondered whether in any other country, curfews get lifted at that God-forsaken hour of 4 a.m. in the morning. What is it telling us? And I think it is telling us, if Comrade Phoebe, if we could just move into the next slide. What is it telling us? It's telling us that the colonial and apartheid legacy of huge spatial injustice still continues in our country. So when we think about the land issue, we need to think in general about the land in the broad sense of the spatial geography of our country. So for instance, the average public transport trip in South Africa, in Tshwane, for instance, is 25 kilometers. In London, it's 8.6 kilometers. In Moscow, it's 7.7 kilometers. So that's telling you that the legacy that apartheid has left us has a huge impact on the working class and poor who are kept away, miles away and have to get up at 4 a.m. in the morning or have to leave home at 4 a.m. in the morning in order for the wheels of the economy to turn on. Next slide. Okay, so it's a little bit out of date, but these are visual pictures of the configuration of cities, major cities around the world. So those tall things are not skyscrapers, but densities of population. So you'll see London is about 7 million, or was back in 20 years ago. Paris about 8 million, Jakarta 16 million. And then down at the bottom right-hand corner is Gauteng. And you can see where the huge concentrations of population density are on the outskirts, or on the peripheries. It's something that we know, obviously, from our reality in South Africa, but I just wanted to illustrate it graphically. Next slide. So when we talk about the land issue, therefore, we also need to bear in mind that, as Comrade Fassia said, it's not just about rural areas, and it's not just about agriculture, although it's critical about those too. But the urbanization levels in South Africa are now 67%. Over 2/3 of South Africans are now living in urban settings, and that's projected to rise to about 71% by 2030. And therefore, when we address the Freedom Charter clause about and the land question, we need to look at other clauses in the Freedom Charter as well, not just that the land shall be shared among those who work it, which is a critical clause. And in particular, we need to look at the clause which says there shall be houses, security and comfort, and all people shall have the right to live where they choose, to be decently housed, to bring up their families in comfort and security, and unused housing space should be made available to the people. So we need to understand that all of that is also part then of the land question and the transformation question, and therefore the expropriation issue. So in short, what I'm saying is that land reform in the first place needs to achieve a correct balance between rural and urban transformation. We have these hugely dysfunctional, unproductive, and hugely oppressive urban spaces where the oppression rests on women, on working class, on the poor. We have very distorted urbanization. We've continued to perpetuate the dormitory township. We have sort of problematic urbanization. I mean, Bushbuck Ridge, where there's urbanization all along the main road. I forget the title of that particular road. And that's why government's integrated urban development framework is a critical document, which begins to look at how we transform urban space and rural space and the spatial realities of South Africa. If I could move on. Okay. The next question I want to pose is, are we trying to achieve, if we're talking about the land question, are we trying to achieve transformation through justice, or are we trying to achieve justice through transformation? Now, you'll see why I pose it like that. The Freedom Charter, as we know, correctly says that the land shall be shared amongst those who work it. It doesn't say that the land must be returned to its rightful owners. Okay. Now, obviously, the Freedom Charter is not in denial, and nor should any of us be in denial about the tremendous expropriation during colonial times of land, of property of all kinds, of cattle, of trading license and so on, that happened during the colonial period. But the Freedom Charter doesn't ask us to look backwards when we look at land reform. It's asking us, it understands basically that broad social justice can only be achieved through the transformation, for instance, in the case of the land to those who work it, through the transformation of the mode of production, the way in which agriculture, for instance, works. Let's move on. Okay. So this means that the land clause in the Freedom Charter also needs to be read in conjunction with the opening statement of the Freedom Charter that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. It's repeated also in the preamble of our 1996 Democratic Constitution. Now, as I said, this is not a denial of the brutal and often very genocidal colonial and apartheid expropriation of land and other assets and resources of the indigenous people. Nor is it a denial of the continued legacy of this racialized, gendered, and class oppression in terms of the way in which space and land is configured in South Africa and the ownership of it is configured. So although South Africa belongs to all who live in it, as we currently stand, the belonging is very unfairly allocated, as we know. But the route out of this continued legacy of land dispossession, of land inequality, the route out of this is a radical national democratic revolutionary transformation and not a return to the past. Because if you want to return to the past, which past is it that you're returning to? Comrade Matthews mentioned what the Goy and San leaders say, that, well, the past is before 1488, when the Portuguese first began to colonize the coastline of Southern Africa. Is it pre-1652? Is it pre-1910? Is it pre-1930? Once you try to restore the past, obviously you must never forget the past, but if your land reform process is about to return backwards, you get into a series of challenges and problems. And it's down this latter route lies the cul-de-sac that I think PAC politics got itself into. And it is the cul-de-sac into which EFF, in my view, on the land question, is often tending to move. Next slide. Okay, so that means that we need to get the right balance between land redistribution and restitution. And I think that quite a lot of our effort after 1994 tended to be focused on restitution. Now, there's nothing wrong with restitution, obviously, in principle, and it's certainly provided for in Section 25 of the Bill of Rights and in generally and in legislation. But there are many problems with putting excessive emphasis on restitution. It's a very complex problem, you know, and often it's poor communities who are most disadvantaged because you've got to, they don't necessarily have papers to prove previous occupancy, previous ownership. There are all kinds of disputed customary rights and so forth that get involved in the process of making land claims. Often the claimants don't necessarily want to go back to the land, and although they get awarded restitution rights, they opt for monetary compensation, which is fair enough, it's justice. But of course, monetary compensation doesn't transform the land question and the national question on the land in South Africa when people who you know, were obviously hugely badly treated through expropriation in the past. You know, it's fair enough that they should get some monetary compensation, but it doesn't act as a transformative thing. And then we all know that, you know, a family or a household that was expropriated in 1950, for instance, has expanded since that original dispossession. So which members of the family, you know, should be restituted and so on. So I'm not arguing against restitution, but I think that clearly to have an effective land reform process, the emphasis needs to be on urban as well as rural redistribution. That's where the emphasis needs to be. Next slide. Okay, so why have we been so slow and why are there problems? I think for some reason we imagine, and correctly the ANC has criticized it in numbers of conferences, but for a decade or so, we somehow got into the notion that you know, we were bound into a willing buyer, willing seller approach. This was a terrible illusion and some terrible things happened. The famous case of the land restitution process and the Mala Game Reserve is a case in point. R1 billion of public money was paid to the owners of that game reserve, who returned then as managers of the game reserve and on a willing buyer, willing seller process. But in my view, we also failed to effectively use what already exists in Section 25 of the Bill of Rights, which basically says that compensation must be just. There should be compensation, but it must be just and equitable. It's not a market-based compensation necessarily. One needs to look at the historical acquisition, how that particular land was acquired, and we know that that's a terrible history in South Africa. What is its current use? Is it just lying idle? Yes, market value is one of the factors that could be looked at. What kind of state investment has occurred in that particular farm, for instance, which was a white farm, which was hugely invested through public money and supported? And what is the purpose of the expropriation? And then also Section 25, as it stands without amendment, has a very important definition of, it says that expropriation can occur for a public purpose, which would be like building a dam or widening a road or something like that, but also in the public interest. And it defines public interest in a very wide-ranging way. It says it includes our nation's commitment to land reform and other reforms to bring about equitable access to all of South Africa's natural resources, land and all other South Africa's natural resources. So constitutionally, we are bound by Section 25 to ensure that we move as aggressively as possible to ensure the equitable access to all of South Africa's natural resources for all South Africans. Let's move along. Okay. So I suspect that we will not achieve an amendment of the Constitution because we would need EFF support basically to do so. And I think that they're going to refuse for grandstanding reasons, and also because they have a very, as Comrade Matthews said, they have a very different view of what expropriation would be. And basically they want state ownership of all land. In other words, to dispossess Black people who have ownership of whether communal land ownership or have some kind of tenure of one kind or another. There will be that dispossession. But But even if there is a constitutional amendment, there will still need to be an ordinary law of what we call of general application to guide expropriation acts to ensure that expropriation meets the test of administrative justice. So we will still need a law that will guide expropriators, those who are to be expropriated, and the courts. And that's why, in my view, even if there's a failure, I know that there's an ANC resolution to amend the constitution to allow for expropriation without compensation. I believe that that can be done in any case with the way in which Section 25 stands, because in some cases there could be nil compensation. In the case of the 20,000 labor tenant former labor tenant farmers in KZN, for instance, who are on white-owned land, but they're basically the farmers, and they've been there, who are farming the land, and they've been there for 2 decades and more. Why should there be compensation to the white farmers who've simply abandoned those farms? So, in conclusion, let me just say that the SACP fully supports the ANC's commitment to diverse forms of tenure security, which would include a public or state, if you like, including municipal ownership of land, communal forms of land ownership, cooperative forms of land ownership, and indeed also private forms of ownership. And in our view, those different forms don't stand in the way of a thorough, radical transformation of the land realities in our country. Thanks very much, comrades. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Jeremy. And we really appreciate, and we will definitely get some of those who need the slides. I'm sure Phoebe will arrange with you in terms of if we can circulate the slides, but they will indicate to Phoebe, who is our general manager in the office of the African National Congress. Then now we will move to one and the only advocate, Thembeka Ngcukaitobi. And I want to encourage all of you to make sure that you read his book that says this land is ours and the land matters. I am busy reading it, but I have not completed reading that book, but it's quite interesting where I've already started reading it. Advocate, it's over to you. Ngeba Jola, Patlumpankomo, Tolela Mampondomise, Ayo nepotism, Namandizenzanga, Ndibekiwe ngoba ndibeta.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I'm most privileged to be here, and I've been very interested to listen to the speakers that have come before me, particularly the outline of where things are standing, what that Dr. Posa provided. It's true that there is a lot of misinformation out there. It is usually better to hear it from the horse's mouth, as it were. What I propose doing is to provide some reflections on the Freedom Charter and talk about what we need today to realize its vision as far as land is concerned. I have 10 minutes to speak, so my reflections will be brief. The Freedom Charter remains an inspirational document for the oppressed people, not only in South Africa, but across the world. Its extraordinary breadth, its ambition, its depth are a testament to the abilities and courage of its writers. The men, of course, who conceived of the idea of the Congress of the People, where the Charter was born, Z.K. Matthews, or Professor Z.K. Matthews, did not attend the Kliptown meeting. Student boycotts of 1955 at the University College of Fort Hare, where he was acting principal, prevented him from doing so. Yet his vision was embodied in the letter and in the spirit of the Charter. In April 1955, when adopting the Charter, the Congress of the People rejected the dichotomy of the colonizer and the colonized, engaged in a titanic struggle for dominance over the other. It argued that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. The prime focus of the Natives Land Act of 1913 had been the imposition of racial restrictions on land ownership by Africans. Now the Charter wanted to reverse this. It specifically stated that the restriction of land ownership on a racial basis shall be ended. The land would be redivided among all who work it. By 1955, South Africa was primarily an agricultural economy, although industrialization had begun. Large scores of young men were driven to work as cheap labor in the farms and in the cities. Alive to this reality, the Charter promised also to end cattle robbery, to abolish forced labor, and to abolish farm prisons. For his part, Z.K. Matthews had envisaged the redistribution of land as central to African liberation. These are his words in 1956. Redistribution of land is not new in principle. It appears in the Africans' claims. It goes even further back, right to the Land Act of 1913. The redistribution of land which was then made was regarded as unfair and has been so regarded throughout, close quote. ANC policy, therefore, in response not only to the reflections by Z.K. Matthews, at the time president of the ANC in the Cape, had favored the abolition of the Native Land Act. Yet, it did not explain how the land would be acquired by the state to enable the non-racial ownership. Matthews perhaps could have been the first to point to expropriation of land as the mode of acquisition. Again, these are his words, quote, "I think that the state would have to use wide powers of expropriation. Experience shows that depending on people's willingness to sell is not sufficient." He then also answered the question of who would be faced with expropriation, who would be the target of the expropriation. And then he answered, quote, "We would expropriate absentee landlords and give both black and white farmers an opportunity of having their own land." Matthews was also clear that compensation would be paid, although he did not expatiate the methodology for calculation. Expropriation for wider distribution accordingly seems to have been part of the official policy of the ANC before the Charter was conceived. It was continued by the Charter. The Charter's vision as expropriation of land and its subdivision to both black and white farmers is now embedded in Section 25 of the Constitution. That clause, we now know, has become somewhat contentious, but it should not have been contentious to start with if its intention was enforced and implemented. The three most important parts to the section are Clause 25.5, 25.6, 25.7. They contain the explicit constitutional mandate for the fundamental transformation of land relations. Section 25.5 is the section which requires the state to take steps to ensure access to land by all on an equitable basis. Section 25.6 entitles everyone to tenure which is legally secure. And Section 25.7 is the constitutional basis for land restitution for those persons who can prove that they lost rights after the 19th of June, 1913. None of these clauses are subject to any contention. The great debate of our times, of course, is whether or not there should be an expropriation without compensation explicitly provided for in the Constitution. Despite early contestation, the ultimate constitutional deal arrived at in 1994 was that no one would be entitled to market-based compensation standards. The basis for any compensation is justice and equity. Quite obviously, sometimes justice and equity will require no compensation at all. One can think of many contexts in which this will be the case. Some of those are already foreshadowed or contained rather in the draft expropriation bill of 2020. Many more categories can be developed as the law matures. The main point I'm trying to put to now is that the debate as to whether or not the Constitution prohibits expropriation with zero compensation or with nil compensation or with no compensation is a moot one, because the Constitution frankly does. Nothing material is to be gained by asserting that this ought to be made more explicit than is already provided for. At any rate, it is an illusion to think that a constitutional text can ever close a debate on any subject. For good reasons, constitutional texts must be open-ended to accommodate social, political, and economic changes as they occur. Our Constitution is also a living document. It evolves as society evolves. And hence, it is always necessary to anchor it on an inexact phrase such as justice and equity. So if the debate on expropriation without compensation is a moot one, as I assert, what should we be focusing on? In one sense, the answers are obvious. We should divide this up between the legislative and the executive programs. Land on its own, we must remember, has no intrinsic price. It is only when there is economic activity around a piece of land or on the land that a price of value can be attached. Starting with the administration, we have pending claims under the restitution program, which were submitted by December 1998. These need resolution. We also have pending claims submitted before March 2001 for labor tenants. They too need attention. We also have the farm allocation program in relation to farms currently held by the state. Those allocations ought to be adjudicated and distributed. We know of the problems here. Some of them were mentioned recently by the Minister of Land Affairs, Minister Thoko Didiza. Often the criteria of who benefits are unclear, the processes of who is allocated are unclear, the rentals are uncollected, farms with occupants are granted to new persons. All of these are administrative problems, but plainly capable of resolution. This is obviously not enough. Some attention must be given to the legislative program. At the forefront is the expropriation bill, which is a promising start. Yet, there are problems there. When I compared the 1975 bill, the 1975 Act rather, to the present expropriation bill, probably 75% of the text is copied word for word. But perhaps that should not be a problem. The main problem is that the constraint of the bill is its location and focus in the Department of Public Works, which is primarily concerned with obtaining land for the needs of the state. So its utility for larger land reforms in the public interest seems to be limited. For its part, the Department of Land Affairs simply does not have a statute to enable it to expropriate land. The Restitution Act, which is the only statute that it implements, allows the department only to expropriate land in the restitution context, and even there, where the claims are uncontested. So despite the potential of the expropriation bill, significant constraints remain. If the intention is to enable the Department of Land Affairs to expropriate land for redistribution, it is clear that the expropriation bill ought to be changed, or alternatively, clauses to the Restitution Act ought to be inserted to give powers, original powers, to the Department of Land Affairs. We have another problem on the legislative front. We do not have legislation to deal with redistribution of land. Even if the land were to be granted to the state, as it is the debate, we have no way of knowing how it will be distributed. So we need urgently a land redistribution bill. Allied to this is the problem of the silos between land affairs and housing. We tend to assume that land is different to housing. Housing, in fact, is not even part of the debate. And so we need to break the silo between land and housing. But we need to recognize, and I agree here with Comrade Jeremy Cronin, that restitution is not the solution. What we need is a future-looking restorative program, which includes a Redistribution Act, but which also includes finalizing pending claims. We do not need a law or an amendment to the Constitution that will place land and power in the hands of the state. Many successful restitution claimants will simply not accept any proposal which seeks to take away the little land rights that they have. What they want is greater protection by the state and from the state, not less protection. They are entitled to more secure tenure, not less secure tenure. The promise of the Charter is to subdivide the land to the people who need it, and not to give up ownership and control to the state. And finally, we need institutions that work. We cannot emphasize this enough. There is simply no revolution without strong institutions. Presently, our institutions are weak, paralyzed, dysfunctional. They need to be rebuilt. They need to be made stronger, not weaker. The Charter's primary promise was that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. But does South Africa in fact belong to all when Africans are locked out of the ownership of land? The Charter may be a document of its day. It may be a product of its drafters. yet it remains relevant as a guide for the future. We should, however, answer today's questions using the Charter as a guide, not as a prescriptive, inflexible, dogmatic document. We should let it flourish in our daily experiences. The Charter is a reminder that what we should never do is to allow our freedoms to be taken away from us. Long live the Freedom Charter. Thank you.
Long live. Thank you so much, Advocate. And then we will move to, I want to apologize first because the speaker from the ANC Women's League was sent to another gadget that I'm using, and it's Comrade Steve Litike. You are welcome, Comrade Steve. And my sincere apology that I didn't recognize you earlier on when I was recognizing other speakers. My apology, my sister. You know in your language, but something like that. I'm still practicing my Sotho. But thank you so much. And I'll hand over to you now to speak on behalf of women of the country.
Thank you so much, Program Director, Comrade Nomantu. Our Matsoho, we are not going to hold any grudges. Good afternoon also to Co-Program Director, Comrade Lamula, and Comrade DSG, comrades who are here, fellow panelists. I want to really appreciate this most important conversation that we are having today about land. Throughout South Africa, the vast majority of women, most of whom depend on the land for their livelihood, are either landless or have limited or unsecured or insecure rights to land. Women's ability to own, inherit and control land and property is vital for ability to access resources and participate in the economy. In South Africa, the Constitution and international obligation promise equal protection and equality with regards to accessing economic benefits. The reality is that laws and practices continues to constrain women's rights, and discrimination practices continue with the horrific levels of gender imbalances against women in all their diversity. We have history, of course, and the history of prejudice that we need to recognize. And our history of prejudice moved from race to sex and even extended to sexual orientation and gender identity that we see. But the history also looks at the role of colonization that we cannot let go, as we have seen the land grab that started historically. And even that extended to apartheid era, the apartheid regime that created Bantustans for Black African communities, and as a result, many people deprived of their land and sources of land. Today, the South African government is still grappling with restitution and land restoration. Customary and traditional practices also result in landlessness in the cases where women are denied inheritance rights to parents' land and are invited for marital home after divorce. Land distribution and restitution programs in South Africa have moved at a very snail pace that many doubt it will ever achieve its intended purpose. Like many rural men, many rural women look at the urban sector and urban employment as a route to household economic survival and advancement. In a context of already high employment rates, women are less likely to secure employment and are paid less when they do so. Access to land does remain a critical factor in the economic survival of female-headed households in rural areas. At the same time, skewed power relations in society result in the fact that men are more vocal about their land demands accordingly. We are concerned, of course, as the ANC Women's League, that the interrelation between men and women or interrelations of gender are critically challenging the women's land rights and socio-economic development, peace, even on security in that manner. The ANC historically also looking at what has been committed from 1992, the land policy document called for special procedures to ensure that women gain equal access to land and participate effectively in policy formulation and decision making. Land is an important source of security against poverty across South Africa, the continent, and development world. Unequal rights to land put women and vulnerable population at disadvantage. The existing gender inequality in access to and control over land and natural resources is an obstacle of sustaining management of natural resources and, of course, of socioeconomic development. Land is one of the cornerstones of economic development, of which farmers, of which other communities base their life, particularly women. Women have historically worked the land, women continue to work the land, and women deserve this equal right of ownership to the land. There is a huge need of intentional knowledge base that needs to build on the purpose of evidence-based planning and even raising awareness of the need to strengthen women's right to land for sustainable socioeconomic development, but also, most importantly, improving the livelihood, environmental sustainability, and of course, enhancing the governance of land and land base of access to natural resources. Women of this country have for a long time been subjugated and stayed without land for a long time, and that is not acceptable. The historic disproportion of majority of South African people does also challenge this notion that we have to challenge now. In South Africa, many women do not have this land ownership, and this is what we call as Women's League to challenge. Now, the latest audit of land ownership trend in South Africa, which look at what was reflected, African constitute 79% of the population as individually directly owning 1.2 of the rural land. The land audit also showed that white owns 72% of total farm and agriculture holding, coloreds own 15%, Indians 5%, and Africans 4%. Women only own 13% of farms and agricultural land, while men own 71%. The same land audit shows that even ownership is disproportionately controlled by men. While ANC has committed to diverse for tenure and including expropriation of land to clearly support the commitment to gender equality. However, we want to caution that policies and legislation alone will not result in gender equality or gender equity in land access and ownership. We must be intentional to ensure the equality and equity of access to land ownership and land rights for women becomes a reality. So it is in the view of Women's League that it is fundamental to understand the call for land for women is not only just a call for land only. It's rather about a call for a workable land for production in order to advance social economic growth and sustainability for particularly women whose rights to freedom still needs to be achieved. I will stop here as our contribution.
Thank you, Comrade Steve. And then now we are moving to Comrade Thoko Didiza, who is our National Minister that will be talking to us, and an NEC Member of Parliament. Over to you, Comrade Thoko.
Thank you very much, Comrade Norman, to our Program Director for today, Comrade J.C. Jewett, the officials of the ANC present, as well as from our provinces, and our Alliance members who have also participated in this platform. I also want to recognize the fellow panelists with me on this platform today as we celebrate the Freedom Charter. At the epicenter of South Africa's liberation struggle was the land question. This is the function of truism that land dispossession is the bedrock of the socio-economic marginalization of the Black South Africans and the provenance of their disadvantage. It is for this reason that all ANC programs since its formation in 1912 preeminently allude to the land question as the main source of the Black people's grievance against colonialism and apartheid. When the Freedom Charter was adopted in Kliptown in 1955, it came as no surprise that a specific clause was dedicated to addressing the socio-economic consequences of the original sin committed by the colonialists against our people. in addition to other social and economic justice clauses in the Charter that are germane to redressing the historical injustices engendered by colonialism and apartheid. It is noteworthy that land reform takes pride of place. It asserts restrictions of land ownership on a racial basis shall be ended and all land redivided among those who work it to banish famine and hunger. The state shall assist the tillers and help the peasants with seeds and implements. Close quote. I won't continue with the other clauses related to these. This particular clause of the Freedom Charter anticipated an interventionist state that would descend into the economic arena and not leave the land question to market forces. It was for this reason that our constitutional architecture has both protective and transformative characteristics as reflected in Section 25 of our Constitution. It simultaneously enjoins the state to take legislative measures to redress the injustices of the past, equitable access to land by those historically excluded by colonialism and apartheid. The land reform programs prescribed by the Constitution constitutes a practical translation of this transformative imperative of the Freedom Charter that land shall be shared among those who work it. If we have to look back a little, as we celebrate 66 years of the adoption of the Freedom Charter, which enshrines the hopes and aspirations of all our people, it is important to reflect on the journey we have traveled in giving effect to what is enshrined in the Freedom Charter. The White Paper on Land, finalized in 1997, set out a clear policy framework on how the state will undertake land reform. The various laws that were promulgated ensured that we are able to implement what the Freedom Charter envisaged. South Africans today can acquire land where they want, even though the issue of affordability is actually a constraint. Movement of people and choices of where they would want to live is another matter that we still need to deal with. Though one can say a majority of people, yes, can exercise the choice, but a majority still cannot. Restitution of land rights have been undertaken under the Restitution Act and transferred land to those who were forcibly removed. There are a number of claimants and communities opted for financial compensation. Those who opted for land were not fully supported with implements and seeds to ensure that they utilize the land productively. Yes, they did receive the land rights that they've longed for many years. The settlement acquisition grant, which is a support that is given to those who have received land, is not enough to address the challenges that communities have faced. One of the observations that is important to note in respect of restitution framework and its meaning is the District 6 case that was brought by the claimants against government around 2018. This case redefined what is the settlement of a claim as opposed to the earlier interpretation. And I think it's important for all of us to reflect on what Justice Kolapen said in that ruling. Actually, what he meant was that returning people to the land without development could not be defined as restitution. Secondly, if one looks at the first Restitution Act, which was based on the interim constitution, there was no time frame linked to it, such as the later version of which was based on the final constitution of 1996, which then determined the cutoff date as 1913. The question is, why did we move towards this direction? I may not have the answer. Probably through the negotiations, obviously you lose some and you win some. When one look at land redistribution, since 1994, land redistribution has been biased, as it has been said by other speakers such as Jeremy Cronin, that it has been too biased towards agriculture as opposed to other needs such as human settlement and other forms of land-based livelihoods. The approach to land redistribution, and I would dare say land reform, has been demand-led as opposed to the state proactively engaging in altering apartheid spatial planning. Again, a point that Jeremy Cronin had actually enunciated. In instances where proactive land acquisition of land was adopted, it did not prioritize farm workers and labor tenants, who are the ones that the Freedom Charter actually referred to. Subdivision of land in order to promote family farms or family farming had not been undertaken, and as such, large-scale farms both have remained and encouraged to be retained as such, and thereby encouraging large-scale commercial farming as we know it, which actually does not assist a majority of people who need or require land for sustenance. Support to family farms as well, through seeds and implements, have not actually been systematic and thereby discourage a number of communities in these areas to utilize their small holding in order to banish hunger and famine. These are some of the challenges that one has experienced in the years that we've been undertaking land reform, some of which have actually been articulated by Ncukai Tobi in his presentation. The major weakness in South Africa's land reform has been lack of coordination across the state and amongst the different spheres. Again, a point that Ncukai Tobi has mentioned in his presentation. The failure to promulgate legislation in accordance with the Constitution as stated in Section 25.5, again, is another indictment on the executive that would not move speedily in this regard. The other matter has been around just and equitable redress as it is defined in the Constitution, that we have never actually tested this formula and therefore leaned much more on one of those requirements which tended for us to use market base valuations to acquire land and to offer compensation. The monitoring and evaluation of programs and agility to intervene timelessly has been amongst challenges that actually the state has faced in the implementation of land reform. Consequence management as well, where acts of corruption and maladministration has been identified, resulting in wastage of resources, has also been one of our weakness. But what has also been done to make sure that we move forward? Firstly, I want to indicate that since 2018, the Interministerial Committee on Land Reform and Agriculture, which is chaired by the Deputy President, was actually established by the President to ensure that there is coordination and there's also development of institutional mechanism to make sure that as government, we actually take land reform as a government program, not just an area where only the Department of Land must deliver. The district development model mechanism will also ensure coordination of all government programs among spheres of government, which would also impact positively on the resolution of land, in my view. The implementation of the recommendations of both the Motlanthe report and the Presidential Advisory Committee on Land and Agriculture remains critical. As part of these processes, already government has developed two policies which have been introduced in cabinet and adopted, namely the National Beneficiary Selection and Land Allocation Policy and the Land Donations Policy. This has been canvassed widely to ensure that we get views from a number of constituencies about how, if the state allocates land, must be able to do. The National Beneficiary Selection Policy seeks to ensure fair, equitable redistribution of land with a targeted focus on women, youth, and persons with disabilities and other marginalized groups, as we have heard from the presenter from the Women's League. The Land Donations Policy seeks to encourage those who have underutilized land, such as mining businesses, churches, among others, to donate land utilizing existing policy instruments to incentivize such donations. On the subject of expropriation of land, the current bill on expropriation, which is actually in Parliament, will assist in creating the framework for the state to expropriate land in the public interest, as well as expropriating land without compensation when necessary. I take the point that Ngugai Toby has made, that it's important to actually reflect to what extent this current bill gives original powers to the Ministry of Land to be able to expropriate land for land reform, for instance. When we look at communal tenure, the current communal land tenure system can be tracked back to the wars of colonial dispossession and was entrenched through the horrible system of apartheid and legitimized through laws such as the Native Land Act of 1913, the Native Trust and Land Act of 1936, the Group Areas Act of 1950, among other policies and legislation. An estimated 60% of South Africa's tenure of land is legally insecure. This is one of the issues that we need to address, particularly the executive and the legislature. If one looks at the amendment of upgrading of land tenure rights, which was actually brought about the challenge to this legislation by communities and individuals, it would actually assist this amendment to make sure that the applications for the conversion of land tenure rights to ownership are realized in our lifetime. When one looks at land tenure reform, it's important to appreciate that the ANC-led government has agreed that we need to appreciate that as a country, we will have multiplicity of tenural system. It is important within that context to look at how to ensure that those people who have got insecure tenure at the moment are protected by the state, as we have also seen the judgment of Ingonyama Trust, which was brought by CASAC against the Ingonyama Trust, where the judiciary has actually ensured that the state must make it its priority to protect the rights of those who are vulnerable with insecure tenure. And if one looks forward, what needs to be done, some of it has already been highlighted by my colleagues. The immediate resolution of the land claims, restitution land claims, as well as labor tenants, working with the Restitution Commission, as well as the Labor Tenant Special Master's Office, is important and urgent. It is also important to ensure that we target farm workers and labor tenants in respect of land redistribution. It is also important to expand our approach to dealing with land reform to actually deal with the issue of spatial planning and thereby working together with the Department of Housing and various municipalities. We need to review and amend the subdivision of land legislation in order to make it possible to subdivide land for various needs, including family farms. We need to urgently develop redistribution legislation as it is stated in Section 25(5) of the Constitution. And I hope our colleagues in Parliament will actually ensure the speedy finalization of the expropriation bill, which is currently in the legislature, so that it can enable the executive to start to use these instruments, among others, to fast track land reform. I want to repeat again that it is important for us to develop clear policy of supporting subsistence farmers, family farms, as well as protecting the tenure rights of communities in traditional areas. Lastly, the effective institutional mechanism to deal with issues of land reform is important, particularly land administration. Chairperson, in closing, I should emphasize that we owe it to those people who gathered in Kliptown in 1955 to have a government that will be efficient with proper legal instruments in place. Such actions are to ensure that the aspirations of South African people to access land on an equitable basis are fulfilled. I want to indicate that the ANC-led government is working hard in improving its instruments and delivery to meet the expectations of our people, working with various sectors of our community. As we know that government alone can never be able to resolve all the challenges that we face alone, but working with communities and our stakeholders, we can actually make a difference. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Titiza. We really appreciate indeed when we say you are one of our architects of land issues. That's the reality that you are showing us today. Thank you for your good input. We really appreciate that. Then now I am going to hand over to my co-program director, the one and the only young lion, our former president, Minagoda Beseni Aseko Youth League, or Ronald Lamula. I never joined any structure, by the way, Ronald, except to have a membership, a youth league, which I'm still keeping it, the old one, Leana Yeniakdal. So I'm handing over to you, my brother, to run with the program, but I will still be with you next to you. Thank you. And thanks for the door-to-door that you have done today.
Thank you very much, Comrade Noman. The door-to-door was also a tribute to the Freedom Charter. Thank you for those thought-provoking inputs by our diverse panel. It is clear from their inputs that the matter is complex, but so critical to building the South Africa we want, and that was envisaged in the Freedom Charter 66 years ago. My name is Ronald Lamula, and I am a co-directing the program with C.D. Nomantu, Nkomo Ralohoko. Some of the key issues that has been raised by the panelists, I think have been highlighted by the latest speaker, Comrade Togo, and I'm not gonna repeat them. Having listened to the organic experts on this topic, we will now move on to the inputs from various provinces, because of course, land dispossession by colonialism and apartheid affected the entire territories within the borders of the then Union of South Africa, but there are historic specificities. There are issues specific to those provinces with former Bantustan territories. Predominantly agricultural provinces have different issues from a highly urbanized province like Gauteng. These differences and issues affected the implementation of the land reform over the last 27 years. We must not only look back, but also hear what we are doing today as we continue to battle to make this clause of the Freedom Charter a living reality. Like the delegations from the provinces to the Congress of the People in 1955, we will hear about your aspirations and plans. We will start with the Western Cape, where the first wars of land dispossessions were fought by the Khoi and the San people, followed by Limpopo, where C.D. Mokobane, Mpumalanga, Comrade Fish Mashalele, Northern Cape, Comrade Mase Manopili, and Comrade Nobulonko Nkondlo representing the Western Cape. Please unmute and take the floor for your 5 minutes intervention.
Thank you. Thank you, Comrade Ronald. Greetings, comrades. And thank you for the opportunity from the Western Cape to make a contribution regarding those groupings that would have been excluded in as far as land access is concerned. I think we start by acknowledging and premising that it is no discovery, but a fact of history that the Western Cape has been ahead of the pack owing to the endowments of the colonial conquest. Something that I think the country would remember it being celebrated in an arrogant way by the former DA leader when she boasted in her colonial tweets. As a former Cape colony under the British and later a union with Dutch rule to force the natives to the sidelines and the hinterland. And this has been one of the historic realities that have actually socially engineered the kind of policies of these colonial protagonists to the kind of disparities and inequality that is experienced by this country 27 years later into the quest to create a non-racial, non-sexist, and equal society. we would remember that Cecil John Rhodes, in outlining the colonial agenda, clarified the vision of the time that we must find new lands from which we can easily obtain raw materials and at the same time exploit the cheap slave labor that is available from the natives of the colonies. Now, it is therefore important to then consider as we reflect on the Freedom Charter, that what is it that we've done as the country, and how do we look at where we are? One of the things that I think we ought to look at is the extent to which statutes have indeed guaranteed in real terms equality and access to land, and also how at times market-assisted land interventions have assisted or hindered or derailed broad-based participation of all, especially if you talk about farm dwellers, those currently in informal settlements or backyards, those who are women and youth, as reiterated by both the comrades of the Women's League and the Youth League that were here in the platform earlier on. One would like to first reflect or record from what a research by PLAS in its study in 2019 of the elite capture in land reform or land redistribution in South Africa. This particular study of PLAS from the University of Western Cape, it asked 4 questions: that who has benefited from South African land redistribution, who have been the winners and losers in land distribution and why, what are the criteria for beneficiary targeting and selection. In the study, one of the things that is glaring that one would like to quote is that from the state land lease and disposal policy here in the Western Cape, amongst the projects assembled is amongst those that were implemented under this policy. For an example, in the Cape Winelands, the study done in 2013 tells us that in the Cape Winelands, you had 3 co-ops wherein there were 58 beneficiaries, and out of the 58 beneficiaries, only 27 were women. And in the same Cape Winelands, you had 2 private farms, and out of them, 13 beneficiaries, and only 4 women participated. In the West Coast, you had 2 private farms, and out of them, 3 beneficiaries and only 1 woman. And in one which was led by a community trust, you had about 28 beneficiaries, and out of them, which demonstrated the maximum participation of women, you had 19 women. One of the things that this also study tells us in terms of these groupings, participation and benefit, is that women and youth categories remained extremely low, let alone women who applied for land as primary applicants and those who are leaders of pre-existing groupings like farm worker co-ops. Men in supervisory positions and leadership positions in the co-ops were the ones that were mainly participating in these particular programs. So in practice, what the study concludes on is that in the main, amongst others, you would find state officials that tended to identify well-off beneficiaries to maximize profits whilst excluding other key objectives in land reform, which is the transformation objectives. Beneficiaries who possess more material resources, knowledge, information to engage in large-scale commercial farming were much more preferred. So you had a situation that in this kind of project under this policy, you had about 19% of women, and barriers were inherent in the design of this particular policy, which was more exclusionary of women and youth because it called for experience in farming and agricultural resources. So the policy was much more biased in favor of commercial success and large farms and wealth. Another point would like to speak on is that if you talk, I think it was already mentioned, I think by one of the speakers, if you look at the land audit, which indicate land ownership by race, which is 70.7 whites, coloreds at 10.7, Indians at 8, and Africans at about 3.5. This again speaks about the land.
Comrade, you will need to round up now. Your 5 minutes is over.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Amongst other issues we would like also to raise is that if you consider also land for informal settlements, the question of immigration, in particular in the Western Cape, has found a situation where informality has become a norm, where majority of people, because of the need for houses, do not have houses. They are therefore subjected into human settlements of Khayelitsha, where you find at most that they do not have services. So these are some of the challenges we want to present in as far as access to land of these vulnerable groups. I thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you. We now move to the province of Limpopo. Comrade More Mokobane.
Thank you, Program Directors, and greetings to the leadership. I'm going to raise a few points in relation to young people and the land question, looking at what is happening in our province, the Limpopo province. To date, there are still a number of questions that haven't been responded to with honesty. The question around who are we compensating, and the question around who are the rightful owners of this land that we want to expropriate without compensation. I believe the leadership is working on that to make it happen, that the questions that are amongst the questions that I've raised will be well responded to at some point. The other issue that I want to raise is in relation to the land that is in the ownership of the traditional authorities. That is the land that the leadership must also speak about, because whenever we're raising an issue as to who is supposed to occupy that land, that they have marked as traditional authorities for the young ones to occupy, there's also a question of tensions brewing amongst them and our local spheres of government as to who is supposed to be in the ownership of that land. That is the question that I also would like the leadership to at some point speak to. Comrade Program Director, we have witnessed a tendency of land grabbing, which to some extent, it contradicts the documents that are there in place in relation to expropriating land. Previous speakers, our panelists, have made mention of number of documents that are working towards expropriating land without compensation, and that I think they're having good intention, but young people are tired of waiting for something that they don't know as to when will it happen. If you can check, most of the occupants of this land are young people whom are grabbing this land because it is not because they don't believe on what we are coming up with as the ANC government, but they're just tired of the relationship between the pen and paper documents, which we don't know as to when will those relationships be implemented. We have spoken around land expropriation, we have planned, we have done all the sort of things that are supposed to be done, but maybe it is also safe to say we need to move from the planning phase to the implementation phase as the ANC to make it happen that the land goes back to its rightful owners. I've spoken about the issue between the traditional authority and the ANC, which I think it must be resolved. And the other issue that I want to raise is in relation to the progress with the Office of Minister Mamtoko Didiza. She made mention of a number of things which I think they're relevant, but I think to a large extent we need to take our communities into confidence as to where are we as the ANC in terms of giving them back the land that is rightfully belonging to them. The other thing that I want to raise is young people are impatient, of course. They need this land, whether they need this land for essential purposes or business, but they need this land. Give them this land and you'll see what they will do with this land. We've seen at around 2018, the NYDA brought their Youth Month program to the Limpopo province, where we visited a number of projects owned by young people, projects that are projects that were funded by the NYDA, where young people in the agricultural sector have farmed a number of things, where young people have opened car wash, where people have done a lot of things with the land, as small as it is. But what we are saying is that, can we come up with something that is tangible enough something that will speed up the process of giving them back this land, because the more they protest for this land, the more things are getting out of hands for the leadership of the ANC and the structures of the ANC there at the ground. I think I've touched on 2 or 3 points that I wanted to touch, that we need to speed up the process of exploiting land. All the policies that are in place, all the bits that are in place, can we make it a point that as the ANC-led government, we urgently speed up the process and make it a point that before things get out of hand, we need to make it a point that the land goes back to the rightful owners. Comrade Jeremy Cronin spoke about something that is in line with the theme of today, and he made mention of, we're agreeing that the land must be shared by those who work it, but also we must also make a point that this land must be returned to the rightful owners. We can be subjected to processes of roundtable discussions as to who is supposed to get what portion of land, who is supposed to do what on the issue of land. While when this land was taken, there were no roundtable discussions. Those who took this land from our grandparents, our forefathers, they just took it without their knowledge. They just took this land against their wishes. We need to make it a point that we take this land back without us wanting to assume as to what will they do with this land. They know what to do with this land. They've been doing a number of things on this land. They farmed, they made a lot of things on this land. We need to make it a point that we take this land back to them for them to proceed with what they were doing with this land.
Comrade More, please round up.
I agree that there are policies in place, Comrade Lamula, in relation to the land, and there are a number of them, but we are pleading with the ANC government to make it a point that we're implementing them. We're moving from an era of planning to an implementing phase so that we can be seen to be working on something in relation to the land, because people are clapping hands for wrongdoings. Young people are grabbing land, and the credit goes to the opposition party, because whenever they grab land, the consequences around the grabbing of land from our local spheres of government, it is not something that we are anticipating for. The consequences are not something that we can celebrate, and as such, they find comfort in the opposition party, like what is happening here in my hometown. Young people have grabbed land. They are calling it within a name of a leader of an opposition party called Juju Park. Something that we need to correct as the ANC and champion the program of land, because we are the ones who came with this initiative, and we are the ones who must make it a point that the land question is responded to. The land is taken back to its rightful owners, and also the issue between our ANC structures and the traditional authorities, it must be resolved, because there are tensions of land is raised as to who is the rightful owner of that land that they have marked. I thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Mure. The next speaker is Comrade Fish Mashalele. Please do not follow the example of Comrade Mure. I do not want to end up stopping you.
No, thanks very much, program directors. Let me extend my greetings to the leadership of our movement, the NEC members led by the TSG, the alliance partners, our panelists, comrades and friends. We want to premise our input on the declaration of the 54th National Conference, which reaffirmed that the ANC will guide the South African economy in accordance with the Freedom Charter's call that the people will share in the country's wealth. The declaration further states that conference resolved that the ANC should, as a matter of policy, pursue expropriation of land without compensation. This should be pursued without destabilizing the agricultural sector, without endangering food security in our country, and without undermining the economic growth and job creation. The land questions remains a source of deep national grievance for Black South Africans because of the history of dispossession. Our approach to land reform must be based on 3 elements as provided in the Constitution. which is firstly increased security of tenure. As you know, most of us who are living in the rural areas under the communal land, the land we find ourselves has got no security in terms of tenure. The issue of land restitutions and the land redistribution. Since the Constitution in its current form thus enables land reform and land redistribution, we need therefore to ask ourselves, where then are the failures? Or why has land reform been so low? Is the amendment of Section 25 of the Constitution as resolved by the 54th National Conference, is it going to unlock the complexity of land reform and thereby accelerate land reform programs? The high-level panel, which was appointed by the Speaker of the National Assembly in 2015, came to the conclusion that the Constitution was not the main reason for the slow pace of land reform and redistribution. It then identifies the following as a challenge, which, as we move forward, we need to say, how then to unlock that? The first one is the issue of poor policy implementation. Second is the lack of agency by government in terms of making sure that we implement what is reflected currently in Section 25, in particular subsection 5, 6, and 7. Increasing evidence of corruption by officials, lack of capacity and training, especially as it relates to support those whose land has been restituted. The problem with narrow focus on restitutions. The question, therefore, that arises is that, as the Comrade Mathers indicated, there are divergent of views by parties in Parliament, of which there's a possibility that we might not be able to muster the two-thirds majority. The issue is then what do we do? How do we make sure that these weaknesses that have been identified by the panel is resolved so that we're able to speed up the process of land reform? Land reform is moral right because it is a right thing to give land back to the indigenous people who were dispossessed of their land. Clearly, Freedom Charter remains our guiding document to move forward decisively towards the eradication of the legacy of racism and sexism, which is still a dominant characterization of land ownership patterns in South Africa. The Charter embodies a vision of an alternative society to the landless society we have inherited. It guides us about broad outcomes we need to pursue to achieve the strategic goal as set out in the 54th National Conference, to pursue greater determination, the program of land reform and rural development as part of the program of radical socio-economic transformation. As we continue with the efforts to accelerate the program of land reform, we should not at any stage lose sight of the heavy responsibility that falls on the shoulders of our movement to lead our country and our people towards a creation of a society visualized by our people when they adopted the Freedom Charter 66 years ago. Agriculture remains an important sector into the economy of Mpumalanga, not only for food security purposes, but also for job creation, particularly in the rural part of our province. This is so because the labor force in the rural areas are largely unskilled, of which agriculture presents a viable option because of its flexibility to absorb less skilled labor. There is, however, an urgent need to pay special focus and attention to structural issues in the agricultural sector such as the improvement of rural infrastructure, providing or strengthening support to Black farmers at both farm inputs and agro-processing. There are land that has been restituted, of which the support was not properly provided. And as a result of that, the communities whose land was restituted still remain in the state where they are. As we round up, we want to compare what General H statement has said, that is struggling to ensure that the land is shared among those who work on it remains a historical and economic imperative, which is central to meet the aspiration of the Freedom Charter in order to address or to redress the wrongs of the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Fish. We now move on to the Northern Cape, Comrade Mase Manopole.
Thank you very much, Program Director, the facilitator, Comrade Lamola, for this opportunity for the province to participate in this important program. As I greet DSG, who's leading the NEC delegation, and the panelists also, let me acknowledge them, and also the alliance partners and comrades on the visual platform from respective provinces. Thank you very much. Comrades, as we commemorate the 66th anniversary of the Freedom Charter under the theme, the land shall be shared amongst those who work it. And it is important to learn from our fallen heroes, struggle heroes. I want to take this opportunity to use this inspiring words of the former president of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, during this period of mourning, and as well we celebrate his life and of undying spirit. As I quote, the inability of those in power to steal the voices of their own conscience in the great force leading to change, close quote. While we seek to build new epoch of the land, we must be preoccupied by those two thoughts. And as we hear today, this year is the year of unity, renewal, and reconstruction of the year of Charlotte Maxeke. It should make us to work very hard to realize the vision of the Freedom Charter in the midst of the new normal of the COVID-19 constraint, as we are reflecting the evolution of the ANC land policy since the ANC Bill of Rights of 1923 and up until to the Ready to Govern 1993 land reform. It is this effort to reconstruct the economy. Ready to Govern becomes our bedrock to take stock of the work done in response to land questions since our guide, it was a guiding document towards the land reform. After democratic breakthrough, we must remind ourselves that large scale of the land reform would improve the livelihoods and promote broader agrarian land, as well as especially the benefit of farm workers, people living in impoverished and overcrowded areas as a historic labor sending region. If we fail to realize these persistent racial inequalities, we will regard as the land as to demonstrate that we are in the path to ensuring that we realize the Freedom Charter. The program director, as we move to the perspective of our province and the challenges with regards to the land, it is worth noting that economic transformation in the Northern Cape economy is highly reliant on mining, agriculture sector, while at the same time, we are experiencing food insecurity, notwithstanding the landmass that at the disposal of our province. While the land reform meant to reverse the landlessness of the rural poor farm workers, people pushed into historic labor, the availability of the land redistribution to in-communal, urban, and peri-urban land and commercial farming area is a process that has been in the snail pace in implementing by ensuring that the land redistribution is taking place. Northern Cape has an average of 47 land owned by the individual, while that land size of the farming and land holding owned by white commercial farmers amongst the racial grouping. So it clearly shows that the issue of the land redistribution has been same pace in our province. For the province to attract young and women to participate in the food security as well as transform the sector, the availability of the land is impediment in this regard. While we're still grappling with the outstanding land claim, which needs to be finalized, amongst the other issues that will be the traditional who are key to ensuring that in the rural areas we are ensuring that the food security is being addressed. For them to be able to participate in food security in the midst of this time of COVID-19. I would like to urge the team today this, and the acceleration of the land expropriation will be instrumental tool to address the current challenges the province is experiencing, which will be the amongst the others we want to wish to address and be able to address this, will be to address and divest land needs, which will be amongst the others agricultural production, human settlement, commonage,
Comrade, must please round up.
Residential and industrial development. Most importantly, it will be to advance access, land access to women, youth, people with disability, and military veterans, as we celebrate and ensure that the land shall be shared among the people who work amongst them. Thank you very much, the Program Director, for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. We now move to the province of Gauteng, Comrade Bones Modise.
Thank you, Chair. If you may allow me to switch off my video for better connectivity.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Program Director, protocol observed. Today's session is extremely important for all South Africans. As you all know, the land issue is one of the topics which has attracted serious political currents in the public discourse. Parliament is also seized with amendment of Section 25 of our country's constitution. And comrades can attest that since the dawn of democracy, a small portion of land has been returned to the hand of its rightful owners. Needless to say, many South Africans continue to be illegally evicted by farmers with immunity, disregarding the Security of Tenure Act. One of the most famous clauses in the Freedom Charter is that the land shall be shared amongst those who work it. The call for transformative spatial transformation is crucial in attending to the land issues. We need to ensure that we create a conscious society which can cooperate with government on transforming the spatial landscape. It is regressive for citizens to petition against government when the government tries to build houses for our people close to economic zones. We further need to change the capitalized idea that proximity of subsidized houses devalues property or land. This is very regressive and it keeps people at the periphery and far away from economic activities. We need also to continue to have discussion with traditional leaders regarding the accessibility of land for women in rural areas. We know that in some areas in South Africa today, it is still difficult for women to access land, and thus we need to address those practices. We need to ensure that with distribution for land for economic use should come with intervention of assistance in ensuring that productivity of land remains in place to ensure food security. In closing, Program Director, we should remember that the 54th National Conference of the ANC held 3 years ago amplified an urgent need to address this land question in a very practical manner. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Bones. I never thought Gauteng has challenges of connectivity. And I also want to thank you for adhering to the time limit. Thank you, comrades from the Western Cape, Mpumalanga, Limpopo, Northern Cape, and Gauteng for your interventions. We are streaming live this webinar on all our social media platforms, and listeners are welcome to post questions and comments. We will now hear from CD China Dodovu from the Northwest, followed by CD Dibulelo Mahlatsi from the Free State, and then CD Tolani Malamlela from the Eastern Cape. Comrade China, the platform is yours.
Thank you very much, Comrade Program Director. COVID-19 has inhibited us from celebrating Freedom Charter Day. Now in my house, I'm celebrating the day. As you can see on my background, I have two little kids that as part of this celebration, I beg your indulgence that they are just going to recite for you Freedom Charter very, very quickly, a minute, and then I proceed with my intervention.
Hello, my name is Sofato. I am 8 years old. I'm going to talk about the Freedom Charter. The Freedom Charter says, we, the people of South Africa, declare for all our country and the world to know that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of all the people.
Thank you. Number one.
The people shall govern.
Number two.
All national groups shall have equal rights.
Three.
The people shall share the country's wealth.
Four.
The land shall be shared among those who work it.
Five.
All shall be equal before the law.
6.
All shall enjoy equal human rights.
7.
There shall be work and security.
8.
The doors of learning and culture shall be open.
9.
There shall be housing, security, and confidence. Forward we are marching to the people's power.
10.
There shall be peace and friendship.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, comrades, that is what I'm doing today in my house. We are celebrating the Freedom Charter Day, and I taught my kids to recite the Freedom Charter, and I hope that this is what we can do so that we must continue to leave the footprint in terms of this seminal document of the African National Congress, and thank you very much for that. Comrade Chairperson, just giving context in terms of the Northwest Province in relation to the theme, there shall be, the land shall be shared among those who work it. In 1912, in our conference, the first conference, Kosi Munsiwa, Wabangolomba Bawati, as well as Kosi Pilani of Bakata Bakatela, were appointed as part of the 9 honorary presidents of the ANC in the upper house of the ANC. In addition to that, Comrade Solpaki, who was a resident in Mafeking at the time, was elected our first general secretary of the ANC. And Comrade George Dixon Munchiwa was elected the corresponding secretary of the ANC. In 1914, Kosi Mwilo Wabahuti attended conference in Kimberley, but also Kosi Mamokhali Wabakwendaba Mohopa attended the conference. That demonstrated the fact that the land question was very much important. It was at the heart of the delegates who attended those conferences from the Northwest, and they served in the National Executive Committee, some of them of the ANC, precisely because of what they stood for in relation to the question of land. Now we must ask ourselves a question, and for me, the question is, what went wrong? What happened? Why have we not fulfilled the aspirations of our forebears in the way that we are supposed to do, in terms of ensuring that indeed this theme, land shall be shared among those who will become realized, because that is quite important. For me, there is no question. The Constitution states what is it that we need to do in terms of the land. The very governed policy document of the ANC that was adopted in 1992 also in precision spells out what is it exactly that we need to do. But also, The policy on the restitution of land that was adopted in 1991 tells us that we must be the first ones as the ANC to accept that despite these good policies, little has been achieved in terms of their implementation, which means, in my view, there is a mismatch, or what I call a dichotomy, between policy development and policy implementation, which means we are not implementing what we have developed in terms of our articulations, in terms of our policies, and in terms of what is it that we need to realize. And as the ANC, we must accept, without being populist, without being arrogant, we must accept that we have not succeeded in terms of ensuring that many of our people have got access to them. Because some of the problems which
Comrade China, please round out.
Yes,
round out. I've already given you a minute.
Yes, without being populist, I think we need a very, very clear, sober conversation as the ANC and answer that particular question and say, what is it in a very progressive way, in a way that will not create problems, in a way that responds to our resolution in the 54th conference, address the issues of land. I wish I had more time to talk about this, but for now it's okay, Comrade Chairperson, and thanks for the opportunity and to represent the Northwest Province. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Comrade China. I have given you more 2 minutes because I was excited by the pioneers and the Masupatsila that you put there. Yeah. Please convey the NEC's gratitude for the work that you are doing and to them for such a good and exciting narration of the Freedom Charter. Yeah. Comrade Mahlatsi.
Very much, Chair. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible, but we can't see you.
Okay.
Yeah,
Chair,
no,
because of issues of connectivity, I would like to put on my video, but I'm going to have connectivity issues. Can I?
Okay, no, that's fine.
Thank you.
Okay.
Chairperson, let me take this opportunity to greet the national officials led by the DSG, NEC members present, distinguished guests, and comrades and compatriots. As the Free State Province, we are highly delighted to be part of this program and to present on a critical element on the land question, which is a redistribution. Presenting on the subject matter, redistribution, we move from a premise that the land question is a motive issue, that desperate and forceful removal of African people under colonialism and apartheid resulted not only in the physical separation of people along racial lines, but also in extreme land shortages, insecure land rights, and poverty for the majority of Black population. Thirdly, that the current legislative policy framework of the Constitution on land reform requires a shift, or rather paradigm shift. That is why the amendment of Section 25 of the Constitution is necessary. As a movement, we must remain resolute in ensuring that Section 25 of the Constitution is amended to address the injustice of the past, precisely because from its information, the ANC has fought for the return of the land to its rightful owners. Fourthly, that the ANC is on course in as far as the land reform is concerned. However, there is a need to relook on the current policy and assess if the current policy on land reform is still relevant to the current societal challenges, and whether the current policy is responding to these challenges. And lastly, how best can we as the movement respond to these challenges? It is indeed the African National Congress that is capable of bringing the land question to its logical conclusion. This logical conclusion is not to deny others citizens either based on their race, class, gender, access to land, use, and land ownership. The resolution of the land question in South Africa is central to the achievement of national democratic society. It requires that we reflect critically and honestly on the impact of transformative legislation. Chairperson, the Congress of the People's Freedom Charter declared in 1955 that restriction of land ownership on racial basis shall be ended, and all land redivided among those who work it, to banish famine and hunger, The Freedom Charter further envisioned a developmental role of the state in the agricultural economy when it stated that the state shall help peasants with the implement seeds, tractors, and dams to save the soil and assist tillers, and that people shall not be robbed of their cattle and forced labor, and farm prisons shall be abolished. Looking at the current land reform program, there are 3 pillars of land reform program, and that is restitution, land redistribution, security of land tenure. Now, when we look at the restitution as per the focus area of the Free State, Section 25, subsection 7 deals with the land restitution cases. And this is in respect of persons or communities dispossessed of their property, and further gives effect to the Restitution of Land Right Act of 1994 to administer the task to establish the Commission on Restitution of Land Right and Land Claims Court. However, since 1994, only 6% of the land has been restituted. Restitution as a program is costly and is milking the state out of its resources. And it takes about 4 years to resolve one case of restitution. The state capacity in as far as restitution is of a concern and has come under question due to the lack of research capacity. Restitution is narrow in approach as it focuses on a clan, family, tribe, and so on, and not necessarily inclusive. And it goes against the very notion of the African National Congress that seeks to achieve a non-racial, non-sexist, and prosperous South Africa. Over the years, our society has evolved and people have migrated from one area to another. And this has led to congestions. That's why we have the likes of Alexandra and Botshabelo in the Free State. This is a clear indication that restitution cannot be anchored on as our land reform program. Comrade Kgalema Motlante's report was the last nail to the coffin when it stated that, his report stated that it will take more than 100 years to finalize restitution. Notwithstanding these challenges associated with land restitution, over 2 million land claimants have benefited from the transfer of 2.7 million hectares thus far. However, Chair, in order to fast track the implementation of our slow-paced land reform program, the ANC 2017 Nasrec Conference resolved that we must pursue with greater determination the program of land reform and rural development as part of our program for radical socio-economic transformation, and that expropriation of land without compensation should be among the key mechanisms available to government to give effect to land reform and redistribution. The South African population has grown by almost 20 million since 1994, and it is projected that the South African population will grow. It will actually double by 2050 to 100 million citizens. This points out
Comrade Mahlatsi, please
round up. It is therefore, Chair, important that we anchor our policy imperatives along the lines of land redistribution, the same way as China has done, in order to deal with the high numbers of unemployment and also address poverty in the country. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you, Comrade Mahlatsi. Comrade Kolani Malamlela from the Eastern Cape.
Program director, and allow me to greet all the invited guests and including
can you please look directly to the camera so that you appear, your handsome self appear very nicely.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm clear now, program director.
Yeah, right.
Program director, we are privileged to be invited here in this very important virtual commemoration of the 66th anniversary of the adoption of the Freedom Charter. This historic document continues to be a beacon of hope for the masses of our people as it enshrines their aspirations of a truly free and democratic South Africa. The question that we have to continually ask the program chair is, as a movement and its alliance components, is whether we are doing enough to fulfill these aspirations in order to achieve the envisaged society. Program director, one of the important clauses of the charter says, the land shall be shared amongst those who work it. We are one of the many provinces that fought many resistant wars against the colonialists who tried to dispossess us of our land. Our gallant kings and chiefs in the province led our people in those battles with pride and won in many instances, but were defeated in some. Hence to us, the struggle to regain our land is very important, program director. Our province is vastly rural and our people used to live through their livestock and tilting their land. And all this was taken away through these wars and were forced to go and seek work in the urban areas. Allow me, program director, to mention that with the limited land that we have as a province, we are doing everything in our power to have it utilized. Through the Department of Rural Development and Agrarian Reform, the province pursues the following: the implementation of the beneficiary selection policy to promote production in all the land reform farms. This new policy is implemented in an open, transparent manner where the department invites applicants to explain, to express interest in the government available farms. The policy includes compulsory training of potential beneficiaries before the land is allocated to them. These land reforms beneficiaries are linked to government support to ensure sustainability. Lastly, the department collaborates with traditional authorities to improve production on communal lands. The situation is at times complicated, program director, by the endless disputes over the right to land ownership between the chiefs and some municipalities. And this makes the plans for development at times to be delayed. In our view, program director, the province is convinced that the willing buyer, willing seller policy has not worked for our government, because nothing moves if those who own the land don't want to sell, and the government cannot take any legal action against them. In conclusion, program director, our province supports the amendment of Section 25 of the Constitution that allows the expropriation of land without compensation where necessary. And the sooner this is implemented, the better. We must also emphasize the point that those amendments should include encouraging the program director, the formation and support to the cooperatives, and also give women and the youth the access to the land, which they've long been denied, the program director. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Xolani. I want to now thank all the provincial delegates for sharing their perspective and enriching our reflection on the land question and what needs to be done. And also to thank Comrade China and his family. They have shown us that the Freedom Charter is cool and radical. We will now watch another video clip as I hand over to fellow program director, Comrade Nomantu Nkomo, the video on the Freedom Charter.
Yeah, that there was, it was stiffening up. It was the laws that were introduced were becoming more and more draconian, in concept. But at the same time, we felt, therefore, that it was necessary to have campaigns to offset this sort of thing and to bring the people up to a higher form of struggle. And that is why we agreed upon having this Congress of the People.
In 1953, December conference, the ANC comes up with the idea of a Congress of the People, right? It takes on. The Indian Congress welcomes it. The Congress of Democrats gets established, had it been established, they come in. In 1954, we organized the Women's Federation, right? In 1955, SACTU. So it's a continuous upward movement of the people participating in the struggle.
There was a broadening of an approach to the question of knowing we are now dealing with a situation where we must mobilize all people, black and white. These are the ideas which led to the Congress of the People, which, when it was called, you included even the Nationalist Party to come along, something like you have today. We called everybody like Fadesa. Those are the ideas which developed there.
A National Action Council representing the ANC, the Indian Congress, Colored People's Organization, and the Congress of Democrats organized a campaign to collect people's demands and grievances throughout South Africa.
There was a great deal of preparation. The door-to-door, coming into a house, telling the people what you intend doing, collecting demands, which is the highest way of exercising democracy.
That campaign was intensive. That campaign was also extensive. We reached out to people in areas which had not been touched before. It was very hard work, and we did not have a sophisticated machinery that we have today to reach out to the people. We used to actually walk by foot. We go to the area by bus, of course. Now to reach the homes, we used to go by foot. They were simple people. They had nothing, there was nothing for them to boast about. They never had any luxury. What they cooked for the day, they offered it to you to eat with them. Now, to the extent that some homes, they used to make that, what do you call that, the beer, in that kaba, in that pumpkin shell. And it used to be really beautiful, the beer, nice and cool, and, they used to offer that to us before we start our discussion. That was in place for tea. So the kaba is to go around, and you got to drink it in a special way so that the tips don't go down your throat and so forth. So these are some of the things that, we used to enjoy with people. And mind you, you just can't just go and say, well, can I just come in and just walk in and so forth. No, you got to wait till the elderly gentleman comes out and says, yeah, Sabon. It's Sabon. Right now, Moses Mabida, my comrade who passed away, you start the conversation. Say, now we came for this and we came for that.
One policeman said that the ANC government, African policeman, the ANC government must demand the equal uniform, not separate uniform. We are wearing khaki uniform. The white people wearing a different uniform. The ANC government must please and give the police a similar uniform to everybody. I mean, those things, I couldn't say that I can't write this thing. I wrote it down.
We wrote it on pieces of paper at the back of cigarette boxes, that were clear, and so on. So that we really covered vast areas in various groups.
We had to explain, look, this is not an easy process. What we are trying to do is to create a new type of constitution, or we want to meet at this very big meeting, and we want to put all our demands there. And at this big meeting, they will decide how to do it. So then they agreed. So on that basis, they say to us exactly what they felt was needed. And immediately the first thing is that we need land. We need better houses. We need better schools. Our children need to be educated in a better way, and so forth and so on. Those were all the demands that were made. And there were thousands of them, all over. And every delegation that came carried their banners, carried their placards, and their flags, and so forth. And you could just see all over, you know, delegates from all parts of the country.
Based on the collected demands, the Freedom Charter reflected a broad vision of a future society. It declared that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, and that no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of the people.
The big-sized cop, I forget his name, he came up on the podium. And he takes his time and he grabs the mic and he says, "Mordauns, you're all under arrest." You know, the way he announced over the mic. Oh, the whole thing, everybody froze, you know, just wondering who the hell this guy just comes and takes over. He doesn't even ask the chairperson for any permission, because he's the police, he's the law of the land. He just, "You're all under arrest, don't move, everybody sit down." And everybody sat down. What can we do? And the tension at that stage, you know, it was so sharp that the slightest provocation, and they could have opened fire on us. But they, you know, we saved the day by somebody, I forget the lady's name now, she came up to the stage, she says, "Comrades, please don't panic. Don't do anything. This is the hour of our discipline. And if we were taught any discipline, we will remain quiet. Let's go into singing." And then she started, Kosi Sigaleli. And I tell you, the beauty and the thunderous, you know, rhythm of that song kept everybody in a disciplined way that nobody did anything. We just let the cops do what they wanted to do. Nobody moved, nobody provocated the police, nothing of the sort. And those guys just couldn't do they couldn't do a thing until they said, this fellow came and said, "Right now, all of you have got to go to the front and hand your dockets in, give your names and addresses and so forth." So then, just prior to that, of course, the Freedom Charter was adopted.
The Freedom Charter again gave great impetus or a variation, I shouldn't say a variation, but more than that, a feeling, a confidence that that is what we need and what we want. So it was a very important factor in development of our movement. And also the non-racial character of the Freedom Charter. You mustn't forget that. So you see, what the ANC is today was actually being formed, or like a baby in a womb, you know, developing to maturity, to birth. It was coming up all the time, from one movement to another.
Comrade Nomantu.
Sorry, I was talking to myself. Thank you so much, Comrade GM. And thank you, Comrade Lamula, for chairing the session with me. We had a rich discussion indeed and inputs, and I will now call upon our DSG, Comrade JC, who will respond to the interventions from our experts and sectors, including the provinces. DSG, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Comrade Nomantu. I'm just trying to log in properly. Good afternoon, comrades, and I must say that this has been a very inspiring and thought-provoking session. First of all, I observed that many of the provinces had elected women to lead their response in this debate, and we must congratulate you for that. It is really beginning to show that we are beginning to understand the importance of the equality that we have in our own organization. As I was listening to some of the inputs, I missed the first one, I think. One of the things that came to my mind is a question Comrade Walter Sisulu would always ask. He says, what problem are you trying to solve? And as I listened to the inputs of all these experts, that wonderful and erudite inputs that we received today, what is very clear is that the politics of the matter we want to resolve is the dispossession of land, and which was one of the diabolical acts of the colonial era and the apartheid era, supported by the Land Act of 1913, the Urban Areas Act of 1923, but dispossession began many, many decades before that. The Native Trust and Land Act of 1936, and the result of all of that was that 13% of the land mass was put aside as what was known as native reserve land. And what each of the experts were talking about is how do we solve this problem, and looking at modalities that would get us to that point. Of course, we want to amend Section 25, and I think comrades have spoken to that. I won't go into that. But I do want to say, I think that it's been quite important to listen to the provinces and the impatience that came through the voices of people that spoke today. As we have the policies, it's time for us to actually act. This webinar and the interest it is generating is indeed an indication of the importance of the land question, as our forefathers and foremothers declared as they adopted the clause in the Freedom Charter, which is the lodestar for the ANC and many other progressive organizations in this country. But it is the policy element from which we drink when we make policies. The issues raised today by our speakers show the absolute critical nature of this issue, as well as its complexities, what it means for young people who continue to face the crisis of structural unemployment, which remains, we keep saying this, unacceptably high. And we also know the answer to that is structurally changing the economy of this country. There can be no other way. We have to radically transform our society and our economic situation. We can call it whatever we like and make many slogans, but that is the answer. We also know that it has, what are the implications, not just for rural and agricultural land, but also urban land that support economic activities for young people. What it means for women who historically and through patriarchy are denied access to land through inheritance practices and other forms of discrimination. What it means to farm workers and labor tenants who continues to face the inhuman reality of lack of secure tenure and because of exploitation. The Freedom Charter says the land shall belong to all those who work it. The land question, as all our speakers pointed to, is a matter of history. Here too, there are issues of interpretation. Where do we start? And how do we do it in a manner that addresses historical injustices as well as advance the building of a national democratic society? What is more equal? That is more equal, just, and where poverty and unemployment do not define who we are. Land hunger is one of the most generative causes of poverty in our country. Over the past 27 years, as was pointed out, we have not done well in meeting the objectives we set out in the RDP we have shown so vividly by the land audit, which was quoted extensively today. We must analyze why, with some reasons given today. Our interpretation that the Constitution does not allow for radical land reform, and our panelists to argue that indeed, some panelists to argue that indeed it does, including allowing for expropriation without compensation. Our choice of willing buyer, willing seller, and market-related compensation, rather than what the Constitution requires of just and equitable compensation. Weak institutions, which meant long delays in implementing laws related to restitution and farm tenure issues, poor integration, working in silos, insufficient focus on urban land, poor support and access to finances. Comrade Togo points out that land was given to people, but they were not given the implements. But it's more than that. People were not given the methodology of modern agriculture either, and have lost over generations and decades the ability to work the land because it was taken away from them. Agricultural extension services are required to support land reform. Our speakers therefore raised the issues: the white paper on land reform, the expropriation bill, the need for a land redistribution bill raised by the advocate, and of course the process that we are undertaking as a nation on Section 25 of the Constitution. Our forebears knew that the land question is an emotive issue, and that is why, in the manner the Congress of the People was convened, everybody was invited to partake in the discussions about their aspirations. The process, therefore, of engaging communities, different sectors, legislatures, and broader public is important, which Comrade Matthew Posa referred to, is not just merely a talk shop, but part of ensuring that we build a national social compact on the redress of this grave historical injustice. Comrades, as I conclude, in a minute, my machine is jumping around. It is important that we stay the course. It is important that our comrades in Parliament understand the politics behind what it is we're trying to do. It is important that we need a 2/3 majority. And one speaker said, what happens if we don't get that? The important thing is that we need to look at any and every possibility to implement the restitution of land to people who've been dispossessed, as well as making sure that there is access to land for young people in this country, and making sure that we expedite on all the various laws that we've got that can assist us in achieving our goals. And as you spoke today, I also want to say that it was very refreshing for Comrade China to bring his family in their full regalia to celebrate the Freedom Charter, as we should all do. But I must say, I want to thank everybody who took the time to participate, who gave of themselves, who gave the inputs that they did, which are going to enrich our debates and discussions. And I can assure you that as this week continues, we will also continue to talk about what we need to do. And we are engaging with our task team very thoroughly and very objectively. I don't want to say much more than that. It is a parliamentary process, and we have full confidence in the task team that we have working with our study group, assisting us to find the right way and the words that we need to amend Section 25 of the Constitution. I can only say once again, thank you very much to all of you. Amandla.
Amandla, Comrade DSG, and thank you very much for pulling together these discussions and pointing to the way forward as critical issues that the ANC and indeed all South Africans must address. This brings us to the end of this 66th anniversary of the Freedom Charter webinar. And we thank our esteemed panelists and provincial representatives, my fellow program director, Comrade Nomantu, and all participants from across the country on Zoom, as well as on other social media platforms. We must keep reminding ourselves and each other that we are still in the midst of the global COVID-19 pandemic, and as a country, riding the difficult third wave. Please wear your masks, avoid crowded gatherings and places, keep social distancing, practice hand hygiene, and those who are eligible to vaccinate during this phase, please do so. Stay safe. Maibu Africa. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Program Director, and thanks to everyone.